And now I'm happy to introduce our next speaker. That's Thomas Girst from Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. And we have yet another speaker with lots of publications on Duchamp. Girst has been chief editor of Tout Fait, the Marcel Duchamp Studies online journal, from 1998 to 2003, and also curated exhibition Marcel Duchamp in Munich 2012, and some of his publications on Duchamp include the Indefinite Duchamp from 2013 and the Duchamp Dictionary from 14. And it's more.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Warmberg, and thank you, Michael Elming, for making all this happen. And I'm really honored to be speaking here, especially, following Thierry Deduve and then with Linda coming up next. So I wanted to take the opportunity to really talk about two Readymades that haven't gotten the exposure that they probably deserve to be getting. One has been completely overlooked by Duchamp scholarship. I'm not blaming anybody here, it's just the way it is, which is that very funny article that I'll get to. And the other is actually his last Readymade, although it wasn't always called a Readymade, and we'll get into that as well, which is Pollyperruque, now with the Staatsgalerie Stuttgart, which is actually planning an exhibition that I've been researching this particular work on later this year. My occupation with that very funny article actually is thanks to Dieter Daniels, who late last year in Berlin at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt was hosting a conference on the Readymade century, which of course was also rather inspiring. I don't want to compete with the notes by Marcel Duchamp, but if we look at the Readymades, when I wrote my Duchamp dictionary, I really tried, okay, damn it, I still have to write that entry on the Readymade, and there's just so much going on. And I'm using actually Thierry Deduve. He referred to it once as an onion, with many, many layers. So I put it right there, and I thought, okay, what do I do with all that onion? That's all German, so don't bother with trying to read it, and it's just there. So it's funny, and it's humorous, but it's also very complex. You have non-Euclidean geometry in there, you have fourth dimensions in there, you have gray matter in there, you have the non-retinal in there, you have the title in there, the signing, the shadows, and what constitutes an object. You have aesthetics and their chance, and all of these things coming together, as well as, of course, and that is very important, to look at the contemporary notes of Marcel Duchamp, while the Readymades, were playing out in time throughout the decades. So, without further ado, I want to go way back to the early Readymades and then, cross the bridge to 50 years later, with first starting with that very funny article, and the other one with Pollyperruque. This is an announcement that was published in the New York Tribune on Thursday, September 9th, 1915. We've heard that Marcel Duchamp, of course, based on the scandal success of his Nude Descending a Staircase of 1913, finally made it to the New York shores in 1915. And here's an article that is actually being advertised on page 1 of the Thursday edition of the New York Tribune for something that would then appear in the Sunday edition of the New York Tribune. You see here, Duchamp, of course, is written wrong, but hey, these things can happen. It's also great, first to last, the truth, and advertisements are the truth, but back then they probably were, more so than today. So you see a little bit of a teaser here when it comes to Marcel Duchamp, and this is the article as it was actually published. This is well known in Duchamp scholarship. It's an article by Henry McBride. Of course, it was basically exactly 3 days earlier, but he was 20 years Marcel Duchamp's senior. And he was a great art critic and a bastion for the defense of modern art. Henry McBride, that Duchamp, I think in 1922, published a book with photographs of Steichen called Some French Moderns, says McBride, in an edition of 100. The deluxe edition, and this was Henry McBride writing an article about Marcel Duchamp. The Nude Descending a Staircase Man surveys us. There Duchamp talks about women in there, the American women. The article is being teased as something where he talks about his obsessions with from Coney Island to anything from musicals to Coney Island. So we get to know the inside scoop of who is that Marcel Duchamp. He's actually being referred to as a very handsome man. We'll get into that. 4 years later, when Duchamp was in Buenos Aires, basically fleeing the French draft shortly before the World War I came to an end, but he was not safe in New York anymore because they were also looking for Frenchmen in New York to get them back into World War I, where his brothers were actually also fighting on the front. So it was Duchamp who then decided to go to Buenos Aires. That's not the topic of my talk, but he actually 3 times he had asked Etty Stettheimer. You probably are very much aware of the Stettheimer sisters. One was building a dollhouse. There must have been Etty was the philosopher and writer that Duchamp asked to come to Buenos Aires. Florine was the painter, and Carrie was building that dollhouse. So here's in French, and actually there's reference, of course, to the book, to the article, "The Nude Descending a Staircase Man Surveys Us," written by Henry McBride, the New York Times Tribune, 12 September 1915, published in 2000 on page 75. As parts of the letters that Duchamp sent, to his friends in New York, to the Stettheimer sisters. That's part of a bigger letter that was actually sent in January 1919. And in it, he basically says, I can go slower, I'm very fast, I can realize that. So, but in it, he basically says, ask Henri Pierre Rocher about the Readymades. And then he says, I quote in English, now I can read the French, that very funny article in the Tribune that you mentioned is a ready-made. I signed it, but I did not write it. I signed it, but I did not write it. And then he says, like, I've never had curly hair, cheveux ondulés. He writes about it because in the article he's being referred to as a handsome man, almost dressing like an Englishman with very good manners, and they refer to his blonde curly hair. So that's a reference to this article. So we know exactly what article it is that he's referring to. And this "I signed it, but I did not write it" is interesting if we look at that article, because there it is. It says, and I'm so happy, Thierry, you pointed out the triple by. It says here by Marcel Duchamp. I signed it, but I did not write it. And of course we know, from that very famous letter that he wrote to his sister Suzanne in early 1916, which is basically half a year after this article was published, and that he writes it, that he tells his sister to write something onto the ready-made in order to turn an object into a ready-made. D'après Marcel Duchamp, and then maybe the letter ends, or maybe it doesn't end. It says by Marcel Duchamp or after Marcel Duchamp. And then we have either a page missing or not. That is being highly debated between Duchampians. But what I'm saying here is that Duchamp actually 4 years later calls this article, and I really have been trying to get the original piece, but it's hard to track down because all the libraries have been throwing out their paper things because now they can be accessed online, as this one can. It says Marcel Duchamp, the Nude Descending a Staircase Man surveys us from 1919 is actually ready-made. He calls it a ready-made. He says this article is a ready-made, and nobody has ever picked up on that. I don't know what to make of it, but I just wanted to throw it out there because my focus is really on Pollyperruque. But the one thing that you should really look at is also, Marcel Duchamp sitting in something that we could call a chaise transatlantique or a deck chair. And there has been there's a note in Duchamp's white box of 1967, 150 edition of 150 of 79 notes. That was published by Cordier and Ekström in New York, facsimiles of his notes. There was a debate about 18 years ago between the champions, Marcel Duchamp, Francis Naumann, and Wanda Rowan Shearer, as well as Stephen Jay Gould, her late husband, about boats and deck chairs. And I just needed to have some connection to Pollyperruque because there's the American woman. We don't need that. There's a note. Where you see the recto is basically something like a watercolor or something that just is meant to resemble a cheap postcard like this. But you're not quite sure whether this could have been a work by Duchamp. Actually, Serge Stauffer, the Swiss Duchamp scholar, says that Tine Duchamp actually thought that this was Duchamp's work. So here's something that is meant to look as if it were a postcard, which you also have to turn 90 degrees in order to read what's on the back. It's published in the speculations section of the white box. It has something to do with, I'm not going to read the whole thing about the 4 dimensions, and there was a debate of how objects can appear. If you look at this like that, you see certainly probably 1, 2, 3 boats. But if you look at look at it that way, the way that you have to look at the postcard if you want to make sense of the reading, it could also be from bird's eye view, the exact same deck chairs folded out as the one that Duchamp sat in the 1999 Readymade of his from the 1915 article. I'm just leaving it at that because I want to bring your attention to another postcard which was also somewhat manufactured, and we are jumping ahead to 1967 to a postcard. What you're actually seeing is the verso of Pollyperruque by Marcel Duchamp. It's a very small Readymade, 14 by 9 centimeters. This is thanks to the Staatsgalerie Stuttgart, who have provided me with a picture. It's not ideal, but of the back of the Pollyperruque. So here again you have a postcard. It's directed, it's sent from Spain, it's sent to Arne Ekström, to New York City. Marcel Duchamp, of course there must have been some sort of envelope around it because there's no stamp or anything. Tarjeta Postal, and naming this Spain is basically, it's very likely that Duchamp sent this from Spain, where ever since the 30s, but at least since the mid-50s, together with his wife, Tine Duchamp, he spent every single summer in Cadaqués in northern Spain, where also Salvador Dalí was living. And Arne Ekström had actually asked all of his artists from the gallery to submit a work of art, and I'm going to show you the front in a second, to a show that was called Polyimagistes. This is the poster for the exhibition Polyimagistes. I was just able to access the archive of Arne Ekström earlier this month in New York City. That's a poster. It's a show that was running from December 5th, 1967 to January 1968. And it was following a show from a year earlier that was called Monoimagistes. And Arne Ekström rather wanted to have a show called Polyimagistes, which means of course many images, because the Monoimagist show was based on single images. But then he said his imagination got hold of him in a kind of progressive way that he couldn't stop himself thinking of poly instead of poly, meaning many. He was turning this into poly, adding another L. And poly, of course, also means pretty clearly parrot. And so what Ekström was actually asking his artists was to send images of parrots. So you have a Man Ray parrot there, you have a Joseph Cornell box there showing a parrot, you have Richard Lindner, you have Isamu Noguchi, you have all these artists, and of course Marcel Duchamp sending in a postcard that was also exhibited. This is a picture also from the archives of Arne Ekström, like this, apparently during the show. This is basically 50 years later, after, and this has already been pointed out, Duchamp's Readymades were shown in 1915-16 without anybody really taking notice. There's only one catalog where it says, to Readymades in 1915-1916 at the Montrose Gallery in New York City and the Bourgeois Gallery in New York City. This is 1967, and also people didn't quite take note of this Pollyperruque. If you look at all the articles that have been written about the show, there's one interesting review where somebody with the initials of AB writes for the January edition of Art Review, and he's hailing the work by Joseph Cornell that has a parrot in it, one of his boxes, as a masterpiece, and he says, "It is a masterpiece, as is the work by Duchamp, which I did not see." That is kind of strange. How can you come to that exhibition, call a work a masterpiece, and you haven't really seen it? So again, you have a Readymade by Duchamp on display, but you have basically no one taking notice, or it's being called a masterpiece without it having been seen. What is interesting to me, of course, is that, and I want to be, if we look at the original label, which I could also track down at the archive of Arne Ekström, it says collage and plexiglass. Plexiglass is clear, it's now no longer within the plexiglass frame, and it says collage. But in the complete works catalog, and ever since then, in 1973, 1989, all the exhibition that was shown at 1991, Palazzo Grassi in Venice, it's always being referred to as a Readymade. And Duchamp was, of course, had a hand in this complete works catalog that Arturo Schwarz was already putting together at the time. So it seems to me that it must have been of importance for Marcel Duchamp to call this work also a Readymade. Now, if you allow me, this is the front of it. If you look at this, muchos recuerdos de Pollyperruque, and then you see birds in the back. You also know exactly what they're called. You have the you have the description right here, and then you have something up front, which can be pulled, not pulled at 4 pins, but pulled at one little thread or string rather, that would reveal something that you probably otherwise wouldn't see. I'm going to get into that, but it's curious to me to see that there's this little string hanging from here. You have a catalog by Marcel Duchamp from 1947, which is about surrealism on 1947 that he did for a Paris gallery show, where he put the rubber foam breast on the front page of the limited edition, and on the back it says Pierre de Toucher, please touch. So this is kind of an interactive sort of ready-made where, ideally you would be able to pull the thread to see what is behind there, because there clearly is something behind there that hasn't been recognized up until today in Aarhus. So just be patient. But I'm going to make this, there's a little bit of, so the thing is, I want this, there'll be some suspense, so I'm just going to, you have to bear with me just for a little bit longer. Right, so I just don't want to forget anything. So here you have those violets, they're called, in pink color, the swallows here, and here the other birds. And it has been, by Thomas Township and later Jacques Comont and Cooper have remarked that this is actually from a page taken from the Petit Larousse. And there it becomes very interesting and clear that if you look at the Petit Larousse, and I have that here, that is the exact detail that Duchamp picked for the front of this here. And that is interesting in many regards. Nobody has shown this page here before. It's also the Petit Larousse, according to Duchamp, somebody wrote that he loved the format and the illustrations on every page, particularly the Petit Larousse. So you know that Duchamp was very much in favor of dictionaries anyway. He preferred dictionaries to books, the way that he also preferred puns to words. And that's where it becomes important also for reading this sort of work, or for adding another layer to the meaning of this work and what it might imply. Duchamp always called language an era of humanity. And he said it's a great enemy. That's the way he referred to language. He often thought that art is not needed to be talked about, because that is just another translation into words that don't do justice to whatever it is that we see or that we take in with our brain matter. Whereas puns he called an infinite field of joy. So we have the dictionary versus the books, and of course he's fond of the Petit Larousse dictionary. He's written about dictionaries, mostly in notes that were then published in the White Box, with the same gallery that he sent Pollyperruque to. And also I think when we look at the puns, and I'm not going to, they're very obscene rather, and they don't fit into this time and age anymore as much as they probably did 20 years ago, so I'm not going to go into the real obscene details of his most often unflattering puns, but we need to go there a little bit, because I want to link this work, Pollyperruque, this ready-made Pollyperruque, to, of course, another work, and that is the work that he was working on in secret, given the waterfall, the illuminating gas he was working on at least between 1946 to 1966 actively, basically finishing that work right before he's sending in from Spain this postcard, Pollyperruque. What is interesting is that what does muchos recuerdos actually means? It means many memories of, many souvenirs of. That's what it means. Many memories, many souvenirs of. And what does Pollyperruque mean? We said Polly is of course a parrot, but Polly also means many. And perruque is of course the French word for wig. So the Duchampians in the room of course certainly know that when it comes to the torso of Étant Donné, Duchamp at the very late while he was working on this changed the hair from black hair to blonde hair, because the blonde hair was that of Tini Duchamp, whom he married in 1954, and the black hair that his torso was originally modeled after was the hair of Maria Martins, the Brazilian sculptor and wife, unfortunately, she was already taken, of the Brazilian ambassador to New York, Maria Martins, that he had a long and winding love affair with between, 1943 and 1951. So he changed that hair. That is basically also that this body that we see here is not a real body, but it is rather a blend, it is an amalgam, it is something muchos recuerdos of women, in this case Maria Martins and Tini Duchamp. And also, I mean, you see here that basically the pudenda is shaved in a way that we refer to today as Brazilian. Maybe that is, I mean, I think Brazilian has to do with something that we started calling it in the 70s, so Duchamp might not even be aware that this also could refer to Maria Martens. But I just wanted to throw that out there as I thought it was. And Duchamp, of course, as you know, he was obsessed with hair. Like there's a Man Ray film that we no longer have of Miss Loringhofen, you already mentioned the Dada Baroness, that Duchamp and Man Ray filmed apparently, where she was shaving her pubic hair. You know, him putting a moustache on the Mona Lisa, then showing it 50 years later, rasé, etc., telling his very first wife, his unlucky very first wife, you know, to shave her, all of her body hair, is something that, of course, resonates with this work, but also very subtly with Pollyperruque, with the many wigs that he refers to here in Pollyperruque, very literally so. Now, where does that take us? And also, I think it's interesting, of course, with the Tondonnais, you have this view, which is the front view, and when you look through these peepholes right here, most of you have seen it, of course, this is what you see. So there's a before and there's a behind, just as there is with Pollyperruque. You know, there's this, what meets the eye, but if you pull that string, you see something else. There's a behind. There's another layer. And I'm going to get to that. Here you see a side view of Pollyperruque, of course, and then you see what Duchamp really did. You know, this is a piece of board, and basically you see that here also very well. Maybe you see here this piece of board. This piece of board doesn't need to be there, but this piece of board actually hides a bird that you would otherwise see. You know, that doesn't really make sense to be there, except for not showing what is behind this once you pull it. And you can bring it down about exactly, you know, if you look at this and if you look at what you can't see, you can bring it down to those 3, 4, 5 centimeters or 2 centimeters that you need to see the bird that is hidden behind here. So what is it? It's the sitacule that is not, isn't that great? Now the sitacule is basically, is part of the family of the perruche, which is the parakeets. You know, so here again it makes sense, the Pollyperruque and the perruche is, that's the only one from the family of the perruche, is the sitacule. Now sitacule, I mean, if there is a pun, you know, what is there? You know, we know Duchamp's very famous pun, L-H-O-O-cul, which is, you know, she has a hot ass, L-H-O-O-cul, and here again, you know, we have a sit and we have a cul, and we have a green bird. And we know how important the color green was to Duchamp, from the green box to the green ray. He must have been very happy to hide that bird, you know, in his little Pollyperruque thing, so that it would become apparent once you pull the little string, and then it becomes very clear when it comes to the puns. And there's more. There's more to that, but I don't want to get into that because I don't feel comfortable speaking about these obscene things in front of the camera. But keep also in mind that the bird, of course, which is, you know, the center of all of this, is of course the ara, is of course the parrot that, you know, Anne Ekström asked to have sent in. But it's also the one bird that is native to Brazil, you know, where Maria Martens comes from. So there's another link right there that you can probably have fun with and toy with. So the one thing that I wanted to say, the one more thing that I wanted to say in this regard is also, and this is basically, the sitacule is called the fig parrot. And you know the female fig leaf, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The female fig leaf was an object that Duchamp first showed in a gallery in 1953 at the Rose Street Gallery, which is the very, very first indication that he was working in secret. I mean, only in retrospect you could link these little erotic objects that they were called at the time to his work on the Tondonnais. So this might be just a coincidence, but it's nevertheless of interest for any Duchamp scholar who spends his time looking at connections, be they right or wrong. So here we go with L-H-O-Q. I made that clear. Now, one thing we have to realize also, not only that the parrot is from Brazil, where Maria Martens is from, but it's also, the parrot also in the history of art stands for, most often, the substitute of a lover in a painting. As we can see in this painting here, by Gustave Courbet, Woman with a Parrot. This is all known in Duchamp's scholarship, that's nothing new. But you see here that, you know, the figure here has been compared to, you know, the lying figure, the lying torso in the Tondonnais, of course, and here you have the woman with a parrot. So the way that the wig, the perruque, is a substitute for the hair, for the real hair that we've seen with Pollyperruque and the changing of the hair and so forth. The parrot, in the history of art, and there's many, many more examples throughout the centuries, is being seen as a substitute for a lover. The parrot is something that that mimics a human, so it's an allegory and a symbol for. Just like the monkey also has been to a certain degree, because of course the parrot can speak our language if we teach the parrot right. Duchamp must have known this painting, of course. That's also not a secret because it's still hanging at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But also there's another painting by Gustave Courbet, which is also linked somewhat to a bird, at least in Duchamp's version of it, which is the woman with white stockings, which is at the Barnes collection, which recently moved within Philadelphia. But Philadelphia is, of course, the location of most of Duchamp's original works, but also of Given, that he's been working on for 20 years in secret between 46 and 66. So here we got Courbet with the parrot, and here we got Woman with White Stockings, which Duchamp basically in the same year, in 1967 or 68, the year of his death, created an etching with, which is called Morceau choisi d'après Courbet, where he also in different versions changes the color of the hair of the woman. And it has been, of course, this is, and Duchamp said it himself, this is a falcon. And in a very obscene way, the female sex can also be referred to as a faucon, which basically sounds the same as falcon in French, faucon, which means false pussy. So we have a false pussy, and we have the real pussy, and we have a false pussy right here, which of course, which is too easy, because this is also not a real one, but it's the painted one. And this is also not, this could also be a dove in a way, if it weren't for those claws. So maybe we have actually 4 faucons here, not just 2. And the interesting thing is, of course, you have to think, this is an etching, right? So Duchamp inscribed this on a copper plate. So what you have here as a mirror image is something that appears right here, the faucon. Yeah? Also on the same page of the Petit Larousse. And what is interesting is, whereas the citacule can be seen when you pull the string, the faucon is completely outside of reach. Like you cannot see the faucon in the parts that Duchamp chose for his Pollyperruque. You just have to track down. Was that clapping? Yes, I think so. It must have been. But you cannot track down. If you hadn't tracked down this very page, you wouldn't find the faucon that Duchamp then made use of, engraving it the same way it's being seen here onto the copper plate, which then becomes mirror reverse, of course, once he creates that etching. No, that's just a few. This is basically it. But it should be. So the one thing that I wanted to say is, and maybe that's just in closing, if we link these works, Pollyperruque to Étant donné, is that Duchamp in his really almost heartbreaking letters to Maria Martens that were published in the Étant donné catalog that Michael Taylor did, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. Very private letters. You get to know Duchamp from a very different side. He's very sentimental, very sad, etc. because his love affair with Maria Martens is falling apart. And he's basically telling her the entire time that he's building, this Étant donné, this torso modeled after parts of her body. But he makes it also very clear that there can be no Ersatz. He says the German word Ersatz. There can be no Ersatz pour l'amour. And he specifies the amour physique. He's left with a faucon, but he doesn't have, he can sublimate whatever he wants in terms of his longing for Maria Martens, but his art just doesn't end up by really giving him the indulgence that probably amour physique would for him. So, we also have it to do here with ersatz, with a substitute, the way the parrot is for the lover and the wig, the perruque, is for the hair. Yes, and I think that is basically it. But I wanted to end also on a positive note, and I hope we can, or not positive note, it is in any case, but just something that makes you laugh. Also, where because I don't know if Duchampians have seen this, but I came across this some time ago. Maybe we can roll that little tape. What you're about to see is a 1-minute excerpt from a film by Robert Butler, The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes, starring, yes, I guess that one might, Kurt Russell. So that's pretty much in the middle of the movie from 1969.
To our Medfield panel. Gentlemen, these are the works of the famous Marcel Duchamp. It's found in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Thank you, Miss Ackman. Please identify.
Number 1 is called Portrait of Chess Players. It was painted in 1911. Number 2 is called The Bride, and it was painted in 1912. And number 3 is called A Nude